They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure can come in many forms, but it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. Our cursed treasure hunt commences with a journey to Imperial Russia. Through the ages, monarchs have constantly sought to outdo each other in a show of power and wealth. Nowhere is this more in evidence than with the sumptuousness of their palaces. And in the early 18th century, this was taken to a whole new level of opulence.
The Amber Room has been described as the eighth wonder of the world. For centuries, it was one of Russia's most prized treasures.
But behind the clouds of war, the Amber Room vanished without a trace, leaving a trail of conspiracy and bloodshed.
The Amber Room tends to confuse people because of its name of the Amber Room. In fact, it was a set of panels, these exquisite panels which were inlaid with tens of thousands of pieces of amber in a sort of mosaic effect. Some apparently the size of your palm, which, considering that amber at the time was about 12 times more valuable than gold, was quite a considerable feat.
Amber is an extraordinarily rare natural product. It's the resin of tree bark, and no one at that time had ever worked with it, had ever used it for decoration.
It's translucent, so it absorbs and emits light in the most spectacular ways, covering a variety of shades of yellow, orange, and gold. They were used to line a room which was commissioned by King Frederick I, the first King of Prussia.
What the creator of what became the Amber Room did was to get vast quantities of amber, and it was applied onto wooden panels which had been coated with gold leaf. And the result, the Amber Room, was absolutely stunning.
It would have been the most extraordinary experience to walk into the Amber Room. So it would have been like walking into a golden chamber, and the room would have been lit with candles, which meant that the flickering light would have sparkled off the many surfaces of the amber effect.
It was intended for the wife of the first King of Prussia for their Charlottenburg palace. But sadly, she passed away, and before the king could finish it, he also died.
When Frederick I died in 1713, his son, Frederick Wilhelm I, came to the throne, and he was a bit less interested in this extraordinary and slightly complex interior. And in 1716, he decided to gift it to Peter I of Russia, who'd expressed interest in it. The Amber Room was initially installed in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, but after some years there, Empress Elizabeth decided to move it to what is called the Catherine Palace, one of these incredible imperial palaces that encircle St. Petersburg.
And there it stayed for more than 150 years. It survived the turbulent times of the Tsars. It survived the Russian Revolution in 1917.
In 1939, the Second World War broke out, and in June 1941, 1941, Hitler ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union is not ready. It's unexpected. And very rapidly, German troops surround Leningrad, as the city then was.
Hundreds of thousands of artifacts were being taken to Siberian mines.
They had already sent 2 full trains packed with treasures, art treasures, from the Hermitage and from these suburban palaces, the former imperial palaces.
The curators wanted to remove the panels of amber from the amber room and take them to safety. When they tried to remove one of the panels, it shattered. The amber by that point was dry, it was brittle, and so they decided instead to leave the panels in situ. They wanted, of course, to conceal it, if they could, from the Nazis, so they covered it so that the Nazis wouldn't know what was there.
Hitler was a keen art collector, and he was on a mission to collect the world's finest pieces and bring them back to Germany. So not surprisingly, he had his eye on the Amber Room.
We know that the German soldiers raided lots of museums and palaces and private homes and took pieces of art. Hitler was obsessed with the Amber Room. It was German originally, given to the Russians. He would obviously argue that it should come back home to Germany.
Rumour has it, it was one of the cultural treasures that Hitler anticipated forming part of his Museum of World Culture after the war, knowing of its value and its meaningfulness to Russia and also of its preciousness as a unique artifact. It became one of the prime targets of the Nazi forces when they invaded the Soviet Union. It was an unbelievable coup when they managed to find it underneath the cladding it had been covered under and then take it to Königsberg. The panels were erected in Königsberg Castle in 1942. Alfred Roeder was the director of the art collections there, and he really oversaw their installation and their care.
He was an amber specialist. He was, in many ways, the perfect man to have in charge of this very precious and fragile work of art. Königsberg was not safe from the Germans being repelled as the Soviet army moved westwards. And as they approached, once again, the Amber Room was packed up into boxes and placed in the basement.
The point at which the order came for Roeder to dismantle the panels, things become pretty hazy from that point on, and this is where the great mysteries and the speculation and the hypotheses begin. He was apparently told to take down the panels to secure them somewhere safe. It's thought he probably did that, but later the castle was the centre of fierce fighting and heavy bombardment, and it eventually suffered a catastrophic fire.
When the smoke had cleared, when the fighting had stopped, there was simply no trace of this extraordinary treasure.
One of the problems with the idea that the Amber Room was bombed and destroyed was that we really haven't found many pieces of charred amber in the castle.
The lack of any trace of the Amber Room in the castle ruins sparked a frenzy of speculation as to its whereabouts. Had the ashes of the Amber Room been returned to the earth, or had it been secretly moved to safety?
There was this idea that these panels miraculously survived the bombardment of a city which was, large parts of which were obliterated at the end of the war and had somehow made their way to safety.
And those theories, those elaborate theories, have become wild. A particularly choice version of this is that just before the end of the war, Hitler ordered the room to be taken to a submarine where it was scuppered and it sank to the seabed, and it remains there ever since. And behind this grand plot is a shadowy cabal so powerful that anyone who dares challenge them or investigate them will die.
One of the more moving myths is the panels were loaded onto the German ship, the Wilhelm Gutloff, which was torpedoed in the Baltic by a Soviet submarine and sank, becoming one of the greatest maritime disasters of all time.
But with no records of the Amber Room on the ship's manifest to prove that it was aboard, treasure hunters around the world have continued to search for it.
People were assembled in special teams, commissions were organised, and of course, fortune hunters set off on their quests as well. They've looked down abandoned mines and bunkers. They've dug for it as if for buried treasure.
You know, people love to see a conspiracy, people love to search for treasure. You've got all these wonderful elements in this story. There are also the theories, of course, that there's a curse.
Over the years, theories that the Amber Room is cursed have gained momentum, fueled by the number of custodians and hunters who have perished in pursuit of it.
The man who was the known last custodian of the Amber Room, Alfred Roeder, a German, a Nazi, died very, very quickly after its loss was discovered. So did his wife. And the doctor who had signed Rhodes' death certificate disappeared. Then a Soviet intelligence officer, a general, who was providing information to a Western journalist who was on the trail of the Amber Room, died in a mysterious car crash. And the most famous Amber Room hunter of them all, George Stein, was found dead in the middle of a forest on his own, and his stomach had been cut open.
A number of people in the story have died, but then, to my mind, a number of people were bound to die for natural reasons during the course of the story, and I'm not a believer in the curse.
The Rhodes did die, but look a little more closely, and there was a proven, recorded outbreak of typhus in that area at that time, and that's what Alfred Roeder and his wife died of. The Russian intelligence officer who was feeding information to a Western journalist, well, traditionally, Russian spies who break their service's tradition of a omerta, of silence, don't tend to have a very long life expectancy.
I don't think there's any curse at all. It was simply the case that people were looking for it, sometimes in difficult places and in difficult periods.
So what happened to the legendary Amber Room?
I think without question, the Amber Room was destroyed, sadly, in Königsberg Castle in 1945, if it hadn't already been badly damaged during the Allied bombing of 1944. And it's become an emblem for everything Russia lost in the Second World War.
For me, the story of the Amber Room is the story of art's role in politics, art's role in war, art's role in international relations. But to many people, it's something golden and glowing and a treasure to be found.
Despite decades of searching and esoteric treasure maps and ever more elaborate theories about what could have happened to the Amber Room, no one has ever found any trace of it.
Treasure hunters beware. If the Amber Room is out there waiting to be found, the trail to finding it is beset with misery and disappointment. Our next stop on our cursed treasure hunt takes us high into the Andes and to a tale as dark as any to be told. Different societies have different cultures, and what is acceptable in one country might seem appalling to another. But in South America, during the time of the Inca, there was a practice that it is hard to imagine anyone could perform.
In March 1999, an archaeological expedition set out into the high Andes on the border between Argentina and Chile. But 3 days into their expedition, 20,000 feet up the Yuyako mountain, they came across the mummified bodies of 3 children. They looked as if they had just died quietly, but the truth was much, much darker.
Yuyako is located on the border between Argentina and Chile.
Back in the 1980s, Dr. Johann Reinhardt had seen on the top of Volcan Yuyako that there were structures. This is essentially the world's highest archaeological site.
The expedition was no simple task. And even in the age of modern mountaineering, it involved months of preparation and weeks of acclimatization on the lower slopes before making an ascent to the summit.
Now, in 1999, when Reinhardt and his team ascended Mount Yuyako, what they discovered was a rectangular burial platform.
As Reinhardt had suspected, this spectacular mountain peak had been the site of some ancient activity.
There were 3 separate stone chambers on top, in each one a child.
Probably the best preserved mummies that we know of anywhere in the world.
They've been very finely and carefully dressed, surrounded by various offerings.
Fully fleshed, fully clothed, with items of prestige that included textiles, that included ceramics, little figurines made from gold, silver and spondylus shell, pointing to each of the 4 corners of the Inca Empire.
The team had made a discovery of a lifetime. These were the tombs of 3 Inca children, undisturbed for at least 500 years, and yet perfectly preserved, frozen in time. The question now was, how did these 3 children come to be on this inhospitable mountain peak? And who were they?
Yuyako itself was once part of the Inca Empire.
Their gods were believed to inhabit this very dramatic landscape. They were a very sophisticated culture that managed to spread through conquest and, in some areas, peaceful expansion. And their genius was to absorb existing cultures and integrate them into the Inca system. And using this technique, they rapidly expanded from Colombia in the north as far south as Argentina. It was a massive, massive empire, and it dominated South America.
They're really well known for some of their amazing architecture, the most popular one being Machu Picchu, which most people have heard of. They had incredible road networks, they had amazing stonework and agricultural innovations as well. And then in the 16th century, they were pretty much obliterated by the Spanish.
Although they were in many ways a highly advanced civilization, they left no written records. But when the empire ended, those Spanish forces did leave records, and what those records described was the Incas' practice of human sacrifice.
Ritual sacrifice was once terrifyingly common in our ancient past, and was even state-sponsored.
The Aztecs were sacrificing by the thousands. I mean, the Aztecs, they were sacrificing war criminals, prisoners, citizens, nobles, you know, everyone. But for the Inca, it was a lot more selective.
So although we tend to think of this as a bloodthirsty, sacrificial population, it's not particularly common. It's a special offering that is made, and these are special children who are chosen for that fate.
They would give this gift to the gods, and in return, they expected help. So they particularly chose to sacrifice in times of trouble, if there was a famine or a drought, or around important events, such as the death of a ruler.
For such a sacred offering, the Incas would only select the purest of citizens for sacrifice. The 3 Inca children on Mount Yuyako had been left as a gift for the Inca gods, but now needed the protection of the archaeological team. Earlier attempts to retrieve high-altitude mummies in other excavations had resulted in once pristine specimens simply crumbling to dust when returned to lower, warmer climates.
It was a race against time, effectively, to safeguard these precious remains.
The reason the children were so well preserved was because of the temperature and, of course, the dry air. So they had to be very carefully wrapped up and packaged. The children were taken to the Museum of High Altitude Archaeology, where they remain today, but they have to be kept in a very carefully controlled environment.
Because of their preservation, there's so much, again, forensically that we can tell about their lives, the way they were dressed, the way they were treated, the way they were prepared for that death, as well as the manner of it.
It's almost as if the children, these individuals, are able to speak to us and tell us something of that journey.
But for all their preparation, honor, and adornment, the details emerged of the children's terrifying journey and the fate that awaited them atop the mountain.
Now, it's quite clear that the two girls died as a result of hypothermia. They'd been effectively sedated with coca leaf and the chicha beer, and this had caused them to fall asleep, and they simply never woke up in the freezing conditions at the top of the mountain, which the Inca regarded as the gods who live in these high altitude places coming to take their victims. So their deaths were seen as an intervention by the gods, divine intervention. In the boy's case, slightly different. He seems to have suffered a far more unpleasant, possibly violent death, a combination probably of exhaustion and high altitude sickness on the way up to the mountaintop.
While archaeologists can be fairly sure that the Inca people held these children in the fondest regard, their journey to the top of Yuyayaco was ultimately to cost them their lives.
Were these children cursed? Yes and no. I think it's all relative. Children in the Western world, certainly in industrial Britain, as young as 4 and 5, were sent up chimneys, down coal mines, died in appalling conditions, in appallingly violent ways. And so I think before we start judging Inca practices, we should maybe compare them to our own practices going back only a century or two.
Perhaps if you're, chosen for this fate at a very young age, we would see that as being doomed and being cursed. But I think this was an honourable offering. It's a high status kind of sacrifice, even though it's distressing to us, because their perception was that these children were going to be given to the gods and enter that afterlife as very special kind of offerings that were received by them.
But if the children were offered to the gods to alleviate a great misfortune, could the removal of the offerings from the mountaintop bring about the return of the curse? A curse that was paid for with the lives of the children all those years ago.
The arguments rage about whether they should ever have been taken from the ground.
It does seem to generate fear. Is it right that we're actually disturbing such a sacred religious site? Is this going to bring us bad luck?
Our understanding of an ancient culture has been advanced by the discovery in the Andes. But there are those who will always say that those poor cursed children should have been left undisturbed in their mountain graves. Our next tale of cursed treasure begins its story in ancient Egypt. It allowed scholars to solve one of the greatest mysteries facing archaeology. But although it would allow us to better understand the ancients, it became a cause of bitter rivalry for those who made the discovery.
The Rosetta Stone is one of the most iconic ancient objects in Egyptology for its role in the decipherment of the ancient language in modern times.
The Rosetta Stone is the remaining fragment of a stela, or a public proclamation in stone, that is written in 2 different languages and 3 different scripts.
It is about just over a metre in height, about 75 centimetres in width, about 30 centimetres thick.
The top part of the Rosetta Stone is missing. It would almost certainly have been an arched top and would have had figures of the king and the gods. But the lower part contains 3 sections of inscription. The top part, which is the most damaged, is hieroglyphic text. The middle section is what's called demotic, which was the very much shorthand version of hieroglyphs used during the late Ptolemaic era. And the bottom part of the text was in Greek.
We know that text as the so-called Memphis Decree, and it is basically a set of tax breaks which are put into the words of the pharaoh of the time, King Ptolemy V, allowing priests of certain temples to be exempted from paying tax.
The Rosetta Stone was found by a French officer during the Napoleonic campaign in Egypt. The aim of the campaign was to exploit Egypt's resources and disrupt trade links between Britain and India.
The Rosetta Stone was found at Fort Julian, just north of Rosetta El Rashid, which is a medieval port city on the Damietta branch of the Nile.
It was found in the foundations of a medieval fortress which, at the end of the 18th century, was being renovated by the French army. As part of this expedition, Napoleon brought with him a corps of scientists and artists who were there to make a record of the country's natural environment and its ancient and historic monuments. And as part of the latter, they were also engaged in putting together a collection of antiquities.
Bouchard, who found the stone, recognized the significance of the trilingual inscription and brought it to the attention of General Menou, who himself took it to the scholars of the Napoleonic survey working in Egypt at the time.
I think as soon as the inscribed side of the stone was revealed, it was immediately apparent it wasn't just another chunk of a pharaonic monument. It was something that could potentially have great significance to the as yet incomplete decipherment of hieroglyphs.
And their intention was that it would be brought out of Egypt and taken probably to the National Collection in France at the Louvre. However, the French expedition was quickly defeated by the British naval fleet off the coast of Alexandria and subsequently on land by a coalition of British and Ottoman forces.
In 1801, after the defeat of Napoleon, the Rosetta Stone became the property of the British. And this was all down to the Treaty of Alexandria.
The Rosetta Stone was presented to the king, King George III, and he donated it ultimately to the British Museum. And it's remained there ever since. Copies were made, lots of copies were made and disseminated, and those were the basis ultimately of decipherment. But the stone itself was seized by the British as, war booty, and then was taken to Britain and put into the British Museum.
Once scholars were able to study the Rosetta Stone, Europeans finally made headway in understanding the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and the race between the British and the French for supremacy in the field began in earnest.
It was just this key piece, undeniably, in this decipherment. And although it wasn't a light bulb overnight moment, it was undoubtedly the key catalyst to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphs and demotic script.
The problem that hieroglyphic inscriptions couldn't be read was one that was a preoccupation of scholars. So once the Rosetta Stone was discovered, it was realized that the ancient Greek texts may record the same text as the ancient Egyptian scripts, hieroglyphic and demotic, this potentially was going to be the key to deciphering the ancient script, ancient language. And so this was seized upon by scholars, some of whom then would spend the next 20 years attempting to use it to bring about the decipherment. And eventually, one of them succeeded.
Many scholars in different countries attempted the decipherment of the hieroglyphic text on the Rosetta Stone.
Two scholars more than any others made use of the Rosetta Stone in their attempts to decipher the ancient Egyptian language. An Englishman, Thomas Young, and a Frenchman, Jean-François Champollion.
In 1814, the English physicist Thomas Young worked on the texts from the Rosetta Stone, but the credit for the big breakthrough in decipherment goes to Jean-François Champollion, the Frenchman working in Paris from copies of the Rosetta Stone, but also vastly assisted by his knowledge of Coptic, the language which is the last vestige of ancient Egyptian.
And although both were along the right track, undoubtedly it was Champollion in France that made the decisive victory, if you like to think of it like that, and established, frankly, this European control and domination over this subject we call Egyptology, because he claimed the prize of deciphering hieroglyphs.
If there was a single moment at which the code was cracked, as it were, it is Champollion who was responsible. And he is the person who published his system, as he called it, for decipherment. In fact, however, the process of getting to that point was a very painstaking and laborious process of decades worth of scholarship on Champollion's part, but also on others' parts, of gradually chipping away. And other scholars do deserve some credit, probably foremost among them the Englishman Thomas Young.
Tensions grew when French historian and linguist Champollion claimed he was solely responsible for the breakthrough, without acknowledging any of the work English physicist Thomas Young had contributed.
In fact, Champollion and Young for a long time were working together, but following Champollion's announcement, he became rather dismissive of Young's achievements and Young's part in things, and they came to be more like rivals. And I think that rivalry is fueled by the wider rivalry of the day between Britain and France.
So not only is there still much discussion over who else can take credit for the breakthrough, there is still a raging argument over where the Rosetta Stone actually belongs.
As with many other artifacts that are taken from other countries, there's been a big debate as to whether it should be returned to Egypt. Many Egyptians, many people very high up in Egypt, really suggest it should come back to Egypt. Zahi Hawass, who was the former antiquities minister in Egypt, put a petition together and got over 100,000 signatures for it to be returned. So it has caused quite a lot of tension over the years as to where it should be and who it should be owned by. Now, because this decree was written about the Treaty of Alexandria back in 1801, this has kind of legally made it the ownership of the British, even though clearly its origin point is in Egypt.
In some ways, because of modern understandings about cultural heritage, the stone is cursed because it has this association with colonial control, of intellectual ownership of ancient Egypt. So in that sense, it has negative associations, undoubtedly.
The Rosetta Stone is incalculably important for Egyptology and involves these three countries with all the associated rivalries.
One thing is certain, this standing stone of knowledge, forged in the cradle of civilization, will continue to be a source of controversy for many years to come. We now travel to Spain and the Prado Museum in Madrid to marvel at our next cursed treasure. But this is no ordinary trip. It is a journey into the troubled soul of a man who was haunted by madness. In the early 19th century, Francisco Goya, a renowned Spanish portrait artist, famed for his depictions of the monarchy, began painting on the walls of his house. Yet few could have predicted the bleak imagery he created. Works of art that would be known as the Black Paintings.
The Black Paintings by Francisco de Goya are an astonishing series of 14 devastatingly dark artworks with ghoulish, macabre themes. It's as if the torment bubbling inside his mind spewed out onto the walls.
Never intended for exhibition, the Black Paintings reflected Goya's dark thoughts on humanity. But what led the artist to cover his house with such ominous images?
Francisco Goya is one of the most important European painters. He made a career in Madrid, where he became a court painter. He's a major artist. He's often referred to as the first modern artist in European art history.
Francisco Goya stands right at the beginning of Romanticism in art. Working in the Spanish court, he managed to work for 4 kings in his time and to produce a body of work which is part of a revolution in the way art's conceived.
During Goya's career, life in Spain had been tumultuous after a period under French rule. King Ferdinand VII had been crowned as the rightful Spanish heir.
Goya saw, and indeed most of Spain, saw Ferdinand as a liberator, as somebody who would bring Spain into a new and peaceful age. And actually what Ferdinand wants to do is turn Spain back to the old days. He comes down very hard on the radicals, of whom Goya is one. So he's feeling fairly darkly pessimistic about life at this point.
He was in extremely poor health by this time. He'd had a bout of cholera, he was almost completely deaf. Psychologically, he was very traumatized. He really wasn't in a good state of mental or physical health.
Withdrawn from public life and tormented by a fear of madness and old age, Goya, now in his early 70s, moved into a farmhouse outside Madrid and set to work.
Nobody really knows why Goya painted the Black Paintings. I think perhaps moving into a house of his own, coming to the end of his life, he finally feels that he can let himself go and paint things that will trouble people. I don't think he has any illusions. I think he knows he's painting truly disturbing images and finally feels free to do so.
Goya was definitely a tortured soul. He had a lot of fear about his own health. He was very worried about the future of society. All of these thoughts were going around in his mind when he painted these 14 murals. He expected nobody to ever see them at all, so this was a way for him to get his angst out of his body and out of his mind.
There's a dramatic, full wall-size painting of a group of women around a black goat, the traditional symbol of Satan, and they're all listening to him with wide-open eyes. The most horrifying of them is probably Saturn devouring his children, which is a monumental figure holding a bloodied corpse.
They're painted in a dark color palette, black, white, red, purple tones. So they're dark in the sense of the color, but also dark in sense of very somber subjects.
Goya made his career in a violent world by identifying the weaknesses and the foibles and the horrors of being human. And at the end of his life, he put all of that into the Black Paintings, and as a result, they have a timeless power that still speaks to us today.
It's easy to see why some might think that the dark themes go beyond that found in Goya's tortured brushwork.
The black paintings are often talked about as being haunted, cursed. I think they are difficult works because they deal with the things we don't like to think about. They talk about getting old, about death, about pain and struggle, and these are uncomfortable, and for that reason they are uncomfortable paintings. Goya had real talent for getting right to the heart of what hurts and then twisting the knife a bit, and I think that's what these paintings do.
I wouldn't say the works themselves are cursed, but they're like a key to unlock the mind of a tormented personality.
Goya died a few years after the completion of the black paintings, aged 82, and it would be another 50 years before they began a journey to a larger audience.
They remained in the house for a long time until 1873, when Baron Émile d'Erlanger bought the house and had them transferred onto canvas with the help of a restorer who made many changes to the paintings in the process. So the paintings that we see today don't look exactly as they looked in Goya's times in the 1820s.
It was an extremely expensive, laborious and difficult process to remove the plaster murals and to put them instead on canvas. The plaster itself had been applied to an underlayer of wallpaper, so the underlying wallpaper had to be removed very carefully and then attached to a new surface of canvas.
Baron d'Erlanger wants to show these pictures at the Paris World Fair in 1878. I think he was hoping that these late works by the artist who by this time is the great Goya, Goya has an enormous reputation, will net him a small fortune when they're exhibited because somebody is bound to want to buy them. Sadly for him, that didn't happen. Paris looked at these paintings and found them too strange, too bizarre, too macabre.
Even today, they cause shock and revulsion. And in fact, some people are so terrified by the reputation of these paintings that they can't even bring themselves to look at the black paintings.
France might have been unimpressed with the bleak images, but Baron Allure soon found a home for them back in Spain.
Today, the black paintings are on display in Madrid, but their power has lasted ever since.
They break away from all the norms of art practice at the time and speak even to a modern audience with real power, and that makes them important.
The controversies continue to trail this series of paintings, which has gone down in history as probably the most dark and disturbing series of artworks ever created.
Today, the black paintings have lost none of their power and continue to offer a window into the heart and mind of a truly tortured genius.